Okay, we can probably get started. What I'm going to do today is show you some things about the PowerPivot data models. My name is Dan Clark. I'm from, obviously from the States. And I'm from somewhere around Philly, so that's about the closest landmark that you probably know. If I told you where I'm from, you guys wouldn't know what it is. And so we go to Philly to have fun. So, all right. So I want to get an idea. How many of you are new to the whole Power BI stack? Brand new. How many of you have cracked it open, looked at it, built a couple models? Okay, good. So one of the things I want to do here is we'll go through it and just go ahead and ask questions as we go through. One of the things I want you to get out of this is kind of what you can do to your data model to make it more performant, what you can do to make it more user-friendly when you do your client tools and so forth. So I'll give you a couple tips and that kind of thing. And then, so I'm not going to go over a lot in DAX or anything like that, but if we have time, we can, of course. So one of the things that if you're brand new to the Power BI stack, or you're looking at the Power BI stack and you're saying, why is this gaining so much growth, and can I ignore it, and all that kind of thing? Well, the answer is no, you can't ignore it. And one of the things that you're going to have is a lot of demand for this. And the reason why there's a lot of demand for it is a couple of things. When you talk about traditional BI, the traditional BI was all IT centric, and then the business would have to go through, the whole scenario of requirements gathering and all that stuff. And so if they're going to end up, saying I want this to do some analysis, this particular data set or this particular column added, 2 months later it gets added and they don't even want it anymore. So the time cycles of relying on IT to manage all this is just too long for business these days. Unfortunately, to the people who, the BI guys that are into SQL Server analysis services and don't want to do anything self-service BI. I got a couple of them in my company. I said, well, you better learn it, because say in about a year you're going to have to know it. So it's not going away. And there's some good reasons for that. So it's more agile to change. Remember, business wants to look at what's going on this week. They don't want to, they might wait a day, but that's about it, that kind of thing. Users have more in-depth domain knowledge. So one of the problems with IT is when you are IT-centric on your BI solution, then you have to kind of get a knowledge of what all that data means to the business, okay? And so there's a lot of disconnect between the business analysts and the IT guys. They don't talk the same language. And so every good IT department needs somebody that actually goes between the business and us geek guys and kind of translates back and forth. So if you don't have one of those, it's a real problem. Well, why not just take that out and say, okay, let's put this in the hands of the guys that have the domain knowledge in the first place. The other thing is users are more technical savvy now. So, you try this 20 years ago and it wouldn't work because, people, they didn't know computers and all that. Now everybody has a computer. So even your typical person in there can be a little bit more technical savvy. They understand if you tell them and show them some things and how to do it. They're not afraid of the computers and that kind of thing. So, you still got people that, maybe near the end of the retirement or whatever, and they say, I don't want to touch a computer and all that stuff. But then you go to the secretary or something like that, and you work with them, and they work with them. The other thing is that disparate data sources. This is huge. Okay, so if you're talking about what kind of data sources we're using now, well, we're using data sources off of the internet. So we have services that sell data. We have government giving away data. All that we can use and combine in with also our business data, business-centric data, and then get some really interesting analysis going on. So this data comes from disparate sources. You got to merge them into a model, and so again, SQL Service Analysis Services is a great product, but it just doesn't. You would probably have to bring it in. The process would be to get a whole ETL, SSIS stack, move it into staging tables, then move it into the data warehouse, and so forth. So it's a huge effort. Okay, and so the self-service BI has tools that make it a little bit easier to do that. And this is actually huge. Better tools that are easier to use and performant. So, and this is not just Microsoft's tool stack, they're all over. I mean, everybody has BI self-service and is jumping on the bandwagon. And the only reason you can do it is because the tools have become a lot better and they've become a lot more performant. So, if you look at PowerPivot is very performant because of how they build it underneath. And you're going to be able to get millions of rows of data and that kind of thing. Not that you should, but you can. So depends on the model. And this is huge here too. So one of the things I try and say for a lot of IT shops is you got to change the way that you look at your relationships with the business. So one of the things you do is you encourage it, show them how to do this, and then what they do is they go out and do prototyping, and then if you say, okay, this is actually pretty good, we want to share this with the whole business, we want to put it up on a dashboard, something like that, then you can easily import that into a SQL Server analysis services and take it over that way. So it's not an all or nothing type of thing. So you're going to have things that might start out in somebody's own personal analysis, then he shows it to other people in his department, they start using it, and then the CIO gets a sniff of it and says he wants it, and then you're going to put it into the repository. So you're still going to have a central corporate-wide type of BI, and you're also going to have these departmental. But this thing is great for prototyping, that kind of thing. And so just a couple of things here on BI users. So not all BI users are created the same. All right, so nearly all users are going to be some kind of report consumer, guided ad hoc analysis. So you don't try and push everybody into the full-blown BI stack self-service. So some of them you're going to end up saying, okay, here's some Power Views. I created the model for you, and here's the Power View to go through and work with it. So again, as an IT guy, I'm not going to just say, oh, you go create the model without me helping you out. Or if you can't create the model, some people, they're just not going to be able to do it. I'll do it for them, and give them this, and then they can create the Power View and do whatever they want for it. Okay, so some people are just going to consume the Power View. Some people are going to create Power Views, and then you're going to have a subset of those which can actually go and create the data models, do some ETL, notice some light ETL stuff, and then you get the really hardcore data guys who can do predictive analysis and all that analysis of big data and so forth. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. So you look at the user and you can determine how much help they're going to need. So here's the BI self-service stack at this point in time, I'm sure it'll throw something else up here sooner or later. So most people, it started out with PowerPivot, Power View kind of thing. And then one of the things with PowerPivot is you can bring data in, but if you need to do any ETL work up front before it gets in there, it really isn't set up for that. Okay, so that was a huge hole in this whole thing. And so to plug that hole, they came up with Power Query. How many people have used Power Query? Okay, if you haven't opened it up, I'm going to crack it open. It's not a thing on Power Query, but you definitely want to start looking at Power Query and playing with Power Query. So this is going to allow you to do the ETL process into your model, and then from there you're going to do your Power View, which is your data visualization. Power View. What do you guys think of Power View? Good? Bad?
End users like it.
End users like it?
Bit of a toy.
Yeah. They're still developing it. I think it's a great concept. The problem I have with it is, and the problem I have selling it, as opposed to some other big solutions out there, is the ability to customize it and that kind of thing. You can't pick the colors you want in there. And believe it or not, that's more important to them than the data. They want to know that these branded colors that they, paid $1 million for just somebody come up with, can be in there. Funny story, I was working for an insurance company, and they had their colors and all that. I'm looking at these colors, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get this thing branded in their way, and then I look over at my Dunkin' Donuts cup, and it's the same colors. So they paid some guy, from a marketing firm, a couple $100,000, and he was probably looking at the Dunkin' Donuts cup saying, hey, I like those colors. So anyhow, so the Power View, it's great. They're adding new, they're adding a lot more visualizations to it too. If you do the Office 365 Power View, which is the web, the cloud version, there's actually they just introduced 4. They have a funnel now and so forth. So this is all being worked on actively, and stuff is being thrown out there all the time. Power Maps. Power Map does. How many of you use Power Map? Now that to me is a toy, but again, it's getting better and better. And one of the things I thought was cool, and I still have to try this, is that you can now do a Power Map of your own map. So you can actually map the inside of a warehouse in Power Map. Do some cool. That's where it's going to start getting cool. It's being able to do your own map layers, and do some of that. So, but I always laugh when they do the video. Look, you can create a video with your Power Map. Yeah, so. Question and answer. Has anybody used that? Yeah, that's one that's actually only on the Office 365 BI portal type thing. But it actually is kind of cool. What happens is you end up taking your model, and your model you're going to create, for example, one table you might create some, it might be called employee, it might be called worker, you can do all that stuff, and then they can type in who is the oldest employee, or who is the longest current employee, or something like that. So it actually translates from normal sentences into a query. Now, under the scenes, you have to actually provide the terms that you're going to use and tell them how to map it. But the user then doesn't have to worry about any of that. You can just use natural language. So it's actually kind of cool. And then SharePoint, obviously, for the delivery and collaboration of it. So you have the BI portals where you can post these things and share them and lock them down and all that kind of stuff. And so why is this so performant? And this is one of the reasons you kind of got to know what the engine does to be able to develop your models. So this X velocity engine, what it does, that's the whole engine that makes this thing performant. So it's not just Exchange or Excel, excuse me, Excel the way it was, they actually added this to it. And so it allows for memory compression, columnar storage, it has data compression to it, and parallel scanning, and it has aggregation algorithms that have been tuned and are very performant. So one of the things there with columnar, what is columnar storage as opposed to row-based storage?
Just storing the distinct values in each column. That if you look at the normal table, you actually have just the distinct column values in there, so you store far less data and it joins through kind of across the ways rather than.
Right. So what happens is when you do row storage, you would actually have every row would have a value in one of these, and even if it's a null, it takes up space, right? So you're going to end up with a lot of repeated kind of things. So if we come over here and we say, okay, column storage, there's only so many products that you have to store. You don't have to repeat them over and over again. So it ends up just storing those particular products, those particular stores, and then when it has to rebuild the row and bring it out, it just uses, indexes to it, pointers to it, okay, and then builds those out. So one of the things that you have there is that you're going to be able to really compress this down if you have certain data types, and what kind of data types would work well with this?
Strings.
Well, I shouldn't say data types, but
Dimensions,
type of data. Anything that has unique values, right? Bucketed stuff. Okay. So if you look at, for example, an a key, a primary key, would that be a good columnar storage? No, because it couldn't compress anything, right? But if I looked at states, for the United States, yeah, it's going to compress it because all you have is 50 of them. All right, so you kind of want to think about that when you're dealing with your data and building your model and what should be in there and what shouldn't be in there. Any questions on that?
Has that always been behind PowerPivot or?
Yes, this actually started out, this is where the X velocity engine was first created. Now they've moved it into SQL Server. So it actually started on this team, and then that provided it worked so well they moved it in the actual SQL Server data engine. So 2014 SQL Server has it built in. Yeah. So. And the other thing is, if you look at when you make your worksheet, your workbook, if you actually do create the zip extension on it, you can actually open it up and see the different files, and there's actually a compressed data file there and stuff and so forth. So that's kind of cool to do if you like to play around. All right, so importing from a database, you're going to have, I'm not sure how much of this to go over. Did anybody say they were new to this, never opened it up? Has everybody used the table import wizard? Okay, so some of the things you can do with the table import wizard that I would probably recommend is you can actually filter these down. So if you look at the preview and filter, you bring that up. Everybody knows you can only select the ones that you're going to need. So one of the things you want to do, and if you're showing somebody how to do this, you want to say, okay, only pick the column that you need for this. Don't pick the whole table and that kind of thing. So naturally you can do that. You can also filter by whatever the field is. So if it happens to be a source type, so let's say that we have these orders. The orders are pending, completed, whatever that is, the stage. And and the person only wants to look at completed orders, then filter it out here before you put it in there. Okay, because even though it handles lots of data, the less data you have in there, the more performant it's going to be, right? So you still have those type of things. The other thing is, even if you use the table import wizard, it's going to write a query behind the scenes. Okay, so, and you can get to that query. So, do you know where to get to that query? I can show you that, because I didn't know right away. So how do I update a query? So let me just show you that real quick, because this might be something new to some of you as far as a couple things. All right, so when you get in here, you can get to manage for the PowerPivot. If you've never done this. And so I brought some tables in here, but if you look at it, you're going to say, okay, I want to bring in tables. And so you can bring in tables from a database. So you have this from SQL Server, from Access, and from Analysis Services, or PowerPivot. You have also from Data Services, Windows Azure, so some OData feeds, which are really popular. And then other sources are going to be down in here. Okay, so you have some other things in here, Sybase and so forth. Data feeds, text files, and all that.
So Dan, sorry, very quick question. In Power Query, there's certainly a different UI. Are there some things which are only available in Power Query that you then just drop into your PowerPivot model rather than?
Right, I'm going to show you that next. So yeah, keep an eye on what these particular data types are, and then I'm going to show you what kind of data types you can get using Power Query. And one of the things I wanted to when I get to that point is the fact that my gut feeling tells me that pretty soon Power Query is going to be the way to get data in here from anywhere. Okay, so but having said that, you can still get in quite a bit of different data sources from using just the PowerPivot itself. Okay. The other thing is, one thing with newbies happen to have, and they say, okay, I want to go ahead and hit from the database, and then they might go from SQL Server, and then they're going to say, well, I want to add another table, and then they go from database again and hit SQL Server. Which is not what you want to do, because if you're going to go to the same SQL Server, you just go to existing connections and say, okay, I want to open up one of those existing connections. All right. So when you bring this in, you'll notice we have all the different data actually sucked in here. And if you go to diagram view, just for those who are new to this, you'll notice that it comes in here, and we have the table set up. Now, some of these actually had, when I brought them in, you end up having this link in there, okay? So you're going to have the link between customer ID and the ID, and the employee ID and the ID. So when you're talking about how does it know when to make the link, how did it know that link was there? Yeah, foreign key relationships in the database. So if your database has foreign key relationships in it, it knows enough to suck those in, okay? Now, even though later on I came and I took this product, the order details, I actually sucked this in from the same database, but I did it at a different time. So if you do it at a different time, it doesn't know to create that. So one of the things that people get confused of is, when does it know to create these links? And how come it didn't create at that time? I brought it in from the same database. That's because it was actually, it doesn't know unless it's the full query and you're bringing it all in. And this one actually I brought in from I brought this in from a text file. Okay, so you can bring it in from a text file. Obviously, that's a different source, so you're going to have to set up the link yourself. All right, and I did want to show. So if I go to the data view and I say, okay, let's take a look at the employee. Well, let's do orders. And so I want to change some of these things. So I want to get rid of a column, or I want to add a column, adjust it somehow. So if I go to the design, it's under this table properties. So this is kind of hidden. I don't like the way they called it that, but if you open that up, you can actually get in and you see that kind of thing. So I think I'm gonna have to edit the hold on a minute. Okay, so if I go into the design again, I say, okay, table properties. One of the things you'll see here is that you can come back in and choose the different columns if you want. You can get in here and you can do a kind of a filter on here. So if I wanted to, I could filter for only checks or cash or whatever. So you don't have to recreate the whole thing. You don't have to delete it and come back. The problem here is where it's hidden. It's under the design tab, edit table properties. The other thing you can do is you can switch from query editor to table preview. So you can come in here and just hard code your query. One of the nice things here is everything you do in that query editor, you'll notice, is going to convert that obviously to a query that the database knows. All right.
Just a security question, Danny. Is that limited to selects? Do you know? Or do you need to be careful with the connection details for your business users?
I'm going to say yes, but I never tested that.
Okay.
But that's a good, and I've never heard anything on it, so that's a great question. I'll try and break it later and see what I don't want to do it now, but that's an awesome question. I would imagine it's limited to selects, but if not, man, I gotta go back and call some people up. One of the things you should notice is one of the big problems with in the old days was sharing Excel files around with all the data is what can you do with those Excel files? Change it, right? Make your own version of the truth. So, but now if you have it in the PowerPivot model, these are all read only. You can't do any changes in here. So it's actually great that way because it's a snapshot of it when you downloaded it or when you refreshed it or whatever. So there's no worry when you throw these around that somebody's going to get in there and fudge the numbers back in the model. So that's kind of a good thing. All right, any other questions on just kind of pulling data down and how you go about doing that?
Is there any limitations with the amount of data?
The limitation is, I would say probably, it depends on the width of it and everything, but I've pulled down 10 million rows. Hasn't really been a performance problem. Now I must say the performance problem is actually more if you're using 32-bit. So I see a lot of limitations on 32-bit operating or Office. Definitely move to the 64-bit.
It's all in memory, isn't it? It's all in memory.
Yeah, because what happens with all this data is when you create your when you actually load that, it actually loads all the data up in memory. Okay, and that's why it's so fast. There's no reading and writing disk and all that stuff. So a couple things there is the more memory you have on a machine. So you definitely want a machine which has, you know, probably 8 gigs of memory for a normal business user, even 16, you know, depending on what they're crunching, and then the 64-bit operating system. That's the first thing I do when I go in and I say, you know, you got to get these guys some 64-bit, you know, machines, because it's not just a, you know, the front end anymore. It's holding it all.
And the 64-bit of Excel as well.
Right, because that's, yeah, 64-bit machine on a 32-bit, and believe me, you have to explain this to people.
Yeah.
64-bit machine, but they buy a 32-bit Office.
All right, so no, Microsoft say stick 32-bit.
So it's like,
What they seem to think.
Yeah.
Well, that's what our IT's been saying, yeah. They said, no, we want the 64-bit. Took about a year.
all right, so the next thing then is creating table relations. Let's go from here. Okay, so remember that you can create your table relationships here, and you're going to need to know what keys are going to be matched up. Now, you have two types of relationships here that kind of throw people sometimes, active and inactive. Okay, and we work with an inactive relationship. Okay, so if you have an inactive relationship will actually come with a dotted line going through there. So the reason why you do an active relationship is the default relationship to walk the path. An inactive relationship would be one that you can actually use in DAX to walk the path. Okay, so this is the one that's used when you slice and dice in the PowerPivot front end. But you can also do a walk relationship using inactive. A good example of that would be you might have a store table, and the store might have opening date, closing date, when it opened, when it closed. So I can use an inactive relationship to a date table and do some analysis on, give me all the ones that were opened in January of 2004. But that's not what my models, you know, my model is a sales model, so it's going to be sales date is the active relationship to it. Okay, so just remember you have two types. The inactive relationship will be shown as a dotted line. You can only have one active relationship between two tables, obviously. You can have as many inactive as you want. All right. The auto relationship detection, if they're coming from the same database, then they're going to actually end up auto detecting. You want to always verify it though, because one of the things that will happen there is if you're pulling it and you might have several relationships defined in between two tables in a database, and it will just randomly pull one as the active and then the other ones as the inactive. So if you ended up, a good example of this is if you go for a, trying to think of one of that. If you hit off of a data warehouse model, a data warehouse model would have a shipping date, a receiving date, everything, and they'd all be pointing to the same date table. Okay, so we would have to say, okay, which one of those is the actual main, the active, and which are the inactive. Okay, and so your active would probably be your order date, right? That's the one you're most concerned with. Your inactive might be the shipping date, something like that. But it's totally random when it pulls it off, because in the database itself there is no concept of active and inactive relationships.
Can you not do composite keys either?
Yes, and that's the next thing I was going to come in here. You can't have composite keys. So if you have a database that has composite keys in there, using composite keys, then you're going to have to do something first. So you can use them, you just can't use them directly. What would you do? Yeah, you would concatenate the two. And so that's common. What I have to do is I'll end up concatenating two of the fields. So I won't have an active relationship until I concatenate two of the fields using DAX. And then I do point between the concatenated fields. Okay, so you pull them in, you create a concatenated field with DAX, and then you link between the concatenated fields. All right? And that's perfectly fine to do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about good model design. And so with the model design, you have one entity per table, obviously. So if you take a look at it, you're going to, when I say one entity per table, what does that mean?
Customers in one table and products in a different table.
Yeah, customers and products you don't want to have, and this is the kind of thing that if somebody who doesn't have a background in databases will end up making these mistakes. So you want to make sure that it's normalized into the fact that you're going to have customer table, you might have a product table, you might have a order table, and so forth. Okay, so that's actually a pretty easy concept as far as that goes. The one that you don't want to do though is you don't want to say, okay, jump down here. Well, I'll say it up here. So you don't want to over normalize. So in a database, a relational database, you might have something like, let's say you have a customer table, and then coming off the customer table, you might have an address table, right? Or something like that. And so this address table would hold customer addresses. This might hold, I'll just go with shippers. So it's pointing back to that address, and it's good normalized design as far as creating that in a database, a relational database that's doing transactional stuff. Well, what we want to do is actually get and use a star schema. And so when I say a star schema, what does a star schema look like?
It's like one fact table with.
Yeah, you want to start thinking about, now remember, this is a warehouse design. Okay, so your model wants to be based on a data warehouse, traditional data warehouse design. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have a fact table, and then outside of the fact table you want your dimension tables, right? And this is why I like Power Query so much. We'll take a look at this in a minute. Is you can actually create these when you pull it in. So when I say fact table, that might be orders, right? Over here would be like customers, shippers, maybe date table here, and so forth. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to do the snowflaking design. And so the snowflaking design would be like what I'm doing here. So you'd have customers, and then off that customer you might have an address. You want to pull that in, okay? So the customer address you want to pull in the customer table. So that's kind of a little fine line. You want to normalize, but you don't want to over-normalize, okay? And the other one that they use a lot is, for example, product, and then subcategory, category. Well, in a relational database, I want to split those out, right? Because I'm worried about space and all that kind of thing. We don't want to do that here. We want to actually move them all into the same table because we're more concerned with what in this type of database? Performance, right? Query performance. So that's the trade-off we use. So even though, but I mean the nice thing is though, if you think back to the X velocity engine, even though I'm moving them all into the same table, does it take up any more space? No. And the reason why is because of what?
Columns.
Yeah, common. So we can really get away with this and not worry about it. All right. So I hope that makes sense because that's key to getting good model design here. The other thing that you may not be used to here, and a lot of people have a lot of traditional SSAS designers have problems with me when I say this, but you want to, you have those role-playing dimensions. Does everybody know what a role-playing dimension is? A role-playing dimension is in a traditional warehouse, you might have order date here, right? And ship date. And then you're going to have one date table, and they're both going to be pointing to that date table. So what we're saying is this date table is a role-playing dimension. It can play either the order date role or the ship date role. Okay, SQL Server Analysis Services is set up to do that, and you should do it in Analysis Services. You shouldn't do it here. So what you're going to do is you're going to just create two tables. Okay, just create the same query over and pull one in, call it order date, and one in, call it ship date. And if you think about it, a date table is small potatoes. How many rows are going to be in that? Maybe 10,000 if you're even spanning a long period. Does that make sense? The other thing I want to pull out here in a good model design here is when you look at date, okay, then you want to go down to time. So some people like to do date time. You want really have a date table and then a known time table. You want to split those. And why would I want to split them?
Be repeating.
Yeah. This is
Yeah, if you throw time in
hours
there,
and minutes in a day.
your 10,000
Yeah.
line table is going to become, millions.
Yeah.
So what you're doing here is if you split those off and you have a time key and a date key, then you're gonna be a lot more performant than a lot less dragging you down. And that throws people a lot. So when I go in there and look at it, and they wanna know why this thing's taking so long to load up and all that, I say, well, let's split these off and see what we can do. And that helps a lot. You want to limit your columns. Talked about that. Remember that, and how many times have we heard this? What data columns do you want? Well, I want them all. You know, look at them. There's 300 columns. You don't even know what half of them are. Let's start small. We can always add a couple for you. You know, that kind of thing. So try and chop them down into, and the way you do that is for performance. You say, if you want this to be performant, let's get rid of all the noise. And if you see one that you want to pull in, we can easily pull it in. We open it up and pull it in, right? Refresh. This is one that catches people a lot of times. Fact table primary key. Okay, so in a fact table, you don't need a primary key, right? Because what's true about fact tables as far as the number of the rows compared to dimension table?
Order of magnitude more than dimensions.
Yeah, they're going to be like, you might have, that's going to be your biggest table, right? So if you're doing transactions, your fact table might be 5 million rows, right? So if you have 5 million rows and you have a fact table primary key, that remember that whole thing about column compression? You can't get the column compression off. Okay? And we don't, there's no place to link that fact table primary key, right? There is no reason for it to be in there. The ones you want to link are the dimension primary key. And you need those. So, but hopefully your dimension tables, I do say hopefully because I've seen customer tables that are like every customer that I ever dealt with since 1900, you know, I mean, I don't think that guy's still living, so you might want to get him out of there. And then a lot of times you're going to hit this, okay, so in your dimension tables, the kind of keys that you want are numeric, right? So you want numeric keys, but a lot of times they'll load in some kind of an alternate key, customer ID or something like that, which is some kind of text. And so unless they need it, then, or unless the dimension's small, I would not bring it in. Now this is one of those things that you have to continually pound on them, is what is this for? Why are we creating this? And what do I mean by that?
What's the distance?
Are we going? Well, are we creating this so you can look up Tom Smith's order? No. We have a relational database for that. There's no reason for doing that kind of crap. And that's the same thing in an analysis services queue. You have a repository that you look up transactions in. This is not for looking at individual transactions. This is for looking at trends. This is for doing analysis of how am I doing in the overall picture of things. So if I want to look at individual transactions, I would create a totally different model. And people don't understand that. I mean, and part of that problem is Microsoft. I mean, because they sold this thing about, well, your analysis services is your data repository. No, it's not. So you're going to have an ODS, which you use, sure, bring everything into the ODS. That ODS feeds your data warehouse, but your data warehouse is not your repository. Pictures. You want to avoid pictures in large tables because what is a picture?
Binary.
What's that?
Binary.
Yeah, it's a blob data type, it's huge. The other thing is they're all unique, so you're not going to get any compression out of it. The way you can actually get around this is hold your pictures outside of the database and or the model and point to it, so you can actually bring those in as a file. But if they're small, I mean, if you're going to have, for example, you might have 50 employees and you might have a picture of each employee. Don't get too worried about it. Okay, you know what I mean. But if you have like products, you have, I don't know, 50,000 products, and you have a picture of each one of those, then you want to start worrying about it. The other thing is timestamps. So remember, this usually happens when you suck everything in and don't even give any thought to what you're bringing in. But there's a lot of timestamps on these fields that again are going to be unique. So there's no way we can compress them. And you don't need them. I mean, a timestamp is not something a real person needs. It's just for the database.
So that's timestamp says in a database timestamp, not a date time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is again what we would want to kind of end up with is some kind of a star schema. And so if you know, if it starts looking like that, you're going to have a good model. So how do I create these models? Well, lately I've been, now that Power Query is there, I've been using Power Query and doing some ETL with Power Query. So if we look at Power Query, what can you do with it? You can discover and import data, and cleanse the data. You can merge, shape, and filter the data, and group and aggregate the data. So a good point here is if you're going to end up showing this at a different grain, let's say, so you're going to want to bring in orders and you have order details, but you really only want to show them at the order grain, then what you're going to end up doing is doing some kind of group or aggregate of it and roll it up. So you might roll it up and say, okay, give me the amount of each order. If you're not really worried about what products, you're only looking at the amount, you would roll it up and group and aggregate it before you bring it in the model because you have a lot less data. All right. So a lot of this was kind of hard to do before we got the Power Query tool. So I do want to show you okay, so here was the PowerPivot. Remember the model for the manage the model for PowerPivot. Power Query is its own little tab on here, and you'll notice that where can I get? Here's the online search from web if you want to discover. That's our whole thing. So that would go out to the marketplace, and you could do there. It might point you to a couple government websites or whatever. But basically, what you're going to do is, okay, I'm going to say I'm going to get this from a file. So you'll notice we have from XML, CSV, Excel, and so forth. From a database, you'll notice that there's a lot more different things in here. As far as the database, you can go from Azure, which is actually getting pretty big right now. So one of the things you could do is pull in, for example, HD Insight. If you have some big data stuff that you want to do, and a lot of places are jumping in on that, you can pull it in here and work with it. And then from other sources, you'll see that there's all kinds of SharePoint lists, SAP, Salesforce, which is a popular one. A lot of people want to pull out of the Salesforce and so forth. Facebook kills me. But anyhow, I guess some people are doing that. And so you have a lot more data sources, a lot more non-traditional data sources here, and there are more data sources coming out all the time. So a lot of a lot of non-Microsoft vendors are creating data sources to plug into there. So if I take a look at, let me just come back in here. I think I have to delete some tables. Okay, so notice in here I have an orders and an order detail. And so what I want to do is I want to get kind of a star schema going, right? So if I want to do a star schema, I'm going to have to combine these two because these are really both facts, right? So I have two fact tables at different grains. I don't really want to do that. I want to have one fact table at the same grain. So how am I going to do that? Well, one of the ways you could have done it is, I could just write a SQL query, obviously, but I want to show you the power of the Power Query. So I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to come back and work with Power Query. So the first thing I'm going to do is go get from database, from Access, and go in here to the Northwind. Okay, and you'll notice that I have now in the Northwind, I can go do, and there's all the tables and views down in here. So one of the things I want to do is I can say, okay, give me multiple items. So it's going to actually have a query for both of those items. So two tables I want to bring in here is orders, and order details. Notice that if you hover over it, it actually gives you an insight into the columns that are there and so forth. So I'm going to say order details. And then one of the things you want to do is, this is kind of tricky or annoying, I don't know which one. If you go down to load to, I don't want to load the data yet. I want to massage the data before I load it, right? So I don't want to add it, and I only want to create a connection. Okay, so, but you still have to click load, believe it or not. So I'll go ahead and load those, and you notice it says load is disabled here, okay? And I'll show you how you want to load, you can enable it then. But the key here is don't load it until you're done massaging it. So first thing I can do is I can come in here to order details, go down to edit, and you'll notice now it brings the data in. It actually brings a sample of the data in if there's a lot of data. So it's not going to bring the whole thing in. And then if you look at what some of the things you can do up here, you'll notice here's choose columns, remove columns, keep rows, rename, you can move them around. You can split columns. So if there's a column I need to split in here, we can go ahead and split those. Here's the group by and so forth. Reuse first row as headers. And if you look at transform, you have all kinds of things that you can do in there, statistical wise and so forth. So you can add a column that would do statistics on this. There's a lot of functionality in here. if I go to add column, notice you can add the column and then say what kind it is or type, what kind of rounding you want to do. There's trig functions, all kinds of things. So I'm just going to come back here and do some really basic stuff. So the basic stuff would be to say, okay, I want to take the order ID. I'm going to go all the way to quantity and unit price. So I'll take that, and I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, remove the other columns. So you go ahead and remove the other columns. And there you are. All right, so you'll notice the applied steps here. So it's going to go down and there's a query name, and then it says, okay, you did the source, you brought in a navigation, always shows up because you navigate to the source, and then it says remove other columns. And then if I did something like, just to show you here, I can move a column. So let's do this. Move to the left. And notice it comes down here and says reordered columns. Okay, so if you're going through there and you say, okay, I didn't really want to do that, you just click here and say, okay, get rid of that one. Okay, now the other thing I wanted to show you is if we come over here, and most of you are going to play around like I do, you're going to go in here and say, okay, what's this advanced editor? So I go to the advanced editor and this is what you get. All right, so behind Power Query is the M query language. So they had to, again, create something else for us to learn. You never have to look at this actually, and I would never show this to a business user or anything. I would show them all the drag and drop and hey, look at this is fun and everything. The only reason I show it to you is you can see that everything I'm doing, it's going to then write in a let statement and then goes through, and you can actually, so you could actually come in here and write your M language directly. And there are some things you can't do in the visual interface that you can do in the M language. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind. As you get more and more into this, you might want to say, okay, I did it through the visual. What did it actually do in my M language? And you can kind of learn some of the M stuff by playing around with that.
Where's the best place to learn the M language?
That's good. There's a book. I'll show you at the end as a resource. A guy wrote, I forget his name. I should remember. Huh?
Chris Webb? Any chance?
Yeah, I think it is Chris Webb. Yeah.
Dave mentioned it earlier.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, I haven't gotten it yet because I haven't had time to really delve into the language. And the other thing is, I don't know if I want to be honest with you.
So,
So,
IntelliSense with that, isn't
yeah. Yeah. So if I could do that, I'm going to write a C# program. Okay, so anyhow, just to show you there, and again, I wouldn't see the problem is as developers we like to push the limits, and we get all now you're seeing all this stuff you can do in the M language. It's just craziness. That's not what the tool is for. The tool is for easy ETL for business analysts. Okay, now it's great that if you want to learn it and you want to become an M guru or whatever, but there's not going to be a lot of people doing M programming, and there really shouldn't be. I mean, if something comes up that you definitely have to do in M, you can't do in the interface, then that's when you crack it open, you go out to these guys and you get their book and that kind of thing. And certainly if you like languages and so forth, go buy, I don't want to say don't go buy Chris Webb's book, but you're not going to say, okay, here, BA guy, write this M for me. I mean, my whole point is to get them to use me less. So only come to me when you really can't do it. So, and that's the kind of thing we want to do.
Useful for similar tasks, is it?
What's that?
Useful for similar tasks. So if you got one task and then something slightly the same, then you could copy that and paste it into another.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you can, but still, I mean, most of them is going to be non-developers using this product. So again, if you really want to turn somebody off of self-service BI, show them and then tell them they're going to have to use them to get this stuff instead of just splitting a column. So now if we go to, so this is, I remove the columns. Now what I want to do is close this, and it says close and load, but notice load to is grayed out because I disabled that, and I do want to disable that. Now if I go to orders, I'm going to edit the orders here, and then what I'm going to do for orders, let's see what I'm going to do. I'm going to take, let's see, order ID. I'll go to here. Actually, before I do that, I want to do this. So the order you do this in is kind of important too. So if I go here to status, I remember I wanted only status 3. Okay. So that filtered it down. And then I'm going to say I want to the ship date. And I can say remove other columns. Another good one here is replace values, so you can actually replace nulls by something if they're coming in here, that kind of thing. But now I have this, so I can actually do a merge. So I'm going to merge queries. So to merge queries, it's actually kind of slick here. So here's my table, and then I'm going to select another table to merge it to, or another query to merge it to. So that would be order details. All you got to do is select what you're linking it on. So I'm going to link it on these. And then I'm going to say only include matching rows, right? It's for an inner join. And say OK.
So somebody joining on a single column, if you wanted to do some sort of compound thing, you'd have to do that. You have to do some sort of concatenation in each of the data sets.
Yeah, you do it just like before, where you concatenate before you did the join. Okay. But you would do that in here. And not in, because this is all before it gets into the model. So you'll notice here I have new column and it has table, so we can say, okay, I want to expand the table. So one of the things you have is you can either aggregate, because it's a one-to-many, right? So you can either aggregate or you can expand. Okay, so in my case I want to expand, but you may want to aggregate. In other words, if you're not worried about products, you just want to worry about the quantity or the unit, the whole total price of the order and so forth, you would aggregate that in there. So I'm going to select, I don't need the order ID, so I'm going to unselect the order ID. Now this is also one that annoys me here. If you don't uncheck this, it actually does the original, so it would be order details dot product ID, and I don't like that. So only if you have name, if you have column name clashing would I actually do that. So I say OK, and so now you'll notice that the product ID and the quantity and the unit price are moved along here. Okay. Now I got one more thing I want to do here is I can go ahead and end up going in and removing actually this row, right? Because this is going to be my fact table. And now what I would do is close this. So I'm going to say close and load. And now what I want to do is get it into my model, right? So how do I get it into my model? Well, I'm going to say over here, click on the orders, and you'll notice it says load to, and now I can load it to my model. Okay, and Microsoft, a lot of their examples, everything, they actually load it the worksheets. And they're trying, instead of the model, it's like, what they're doing is they're trying to say, okay, let's just bring in one big hunkin' denormalized piece of garbage. Don't do that. Load it to the model and have the model feed your stuff. So I'm going to load this, and then you'll notice it will load in. And so now if I come back to my manage the model, you'll notice now I have my orders in here, and inside there, so it's at the order detail grain. And so now I can start going in and doing my connection to my employee, product ID, and then customer ID. And now I have a pretty good model, right? So does that make sense? Okay, so you want to kind of think about this, because you're going to run into this a lot where you're going to have order headers and order details, or you're going to have two that really, your facts are distributed across two tables. You want them into one fact table at whatever grain you're deciding that you decide. All right, and that's a great use of the Power Query is a great use to clean stuff up before you get into the model. You can, like it said, split the columns out. A lot of times you'll have that where you're going to have to split columns out because they're comma delimited and that kind of thing. Especially when you start grabbing from alternate sources like text files and things, you're going to have to do some kind of a massaging of the data before you bring it in. And it's much easier to do it in Power Query than it is PowerPivot. All right. All right, so I'm going to rush. I only have like 15 minutes, so I'm going to rush through a couple other things that I think is important. But that was actually the meat of it. Okay, so some things you can do for a user-friendly model, and you want to start doing this kind of thing, because nothing turns off users more than when they go in and they try and go to PowerView and they see all this garbage that they don't want to see. They have to churn through it and everything. So if you look at the renaming tables and fields, a big thing. You remember you want to name it as the business would use it. You don't want to name it from just take it blindly through from your sources. So you can easily in your model rename tables and fields. This is huge. Hiding columns. What kind of columns do you want to hide? Keys. Don't ever show keys up, from in the client. They don't need to see the keys. The only reason the keys are there for the model. A set of appropriate data types is important. So a lot of times when you suck this stuff in from a text file, what's everything going to be? Text. Okay, so you want to then in your model go ahead and set it as the appropriate data type. And formats, you can set the data format. So date formats that they want to see, you can change it between the different date formats. Currency is a big one, so the currency format, that kind of thing. And this is huge, set column summarization. Okay, so I want to show you what I mean by that. And I'll show you that in a minute. I'll go through this and then I'll probably have time for one more. And then I'll show you where some of this stuff is. Hierarchies. So the hierarchies are really going to aid in drilling down and rolling up numbers. Okay, so when you're doing hierarchies, though, you want to really, the big mistake is that people create unnatural hierarchies. And what I mean by unnatural hierarchies, if I have a year, quarter, month, you'll notice that if I have a quarter, 1, 2, 3, 4, you don't really know what its parent is, right? So it's a big strain on the model to figure all that out. Okay, so on the thing, so what you want to do is base it on natural hierarchies instead. So instead of doing just quarter, you would have a column that has the year and the quarter. And then what you would do is say year, quarter, year, month. And now when the model has to drill down through or roll back up, it takes away a lot of the, makes it a lot easier on the model. Okay. Hierarchies are really easy in PowerPivot, not like in SQL Server Analysis Services. Now DAX, again, I'm not going to go over just DAX by itself, but you'll notice one of the things I do want to say about DAX, and if you're new to this, you really to write DAX, you have to know what the context is. So the whole thing here is the context is what filters are going to be applied on this, okay? If you can figure out what the context is, then you can write good DAX, okay? So in this particular case, what you're going to see is we have the sum of the sales, and we actually have a couple of different contexts in here. So one of the contexts is going to be the row and the column context. So we're saying that this is going to be Europe, and this is going to be games and toys. Then you're going to have a filter context put in here by the reseller, and you're going to have the calendar year is going to end up being one of the contexts in there. Okay. In your DAX, you can override your context, right? So I can go in and say, if I wanted to do percentage of total sales, right? I would have to have a DAX that I would write, and I would override the context of, let's say, for example, what is that? Category. Excuse me. So the category here, I would actually have to override the category. So no matter what category they put on it, it would show me the total of all the categories, and then I would divide the this number by the total of all the categories, and then that would give me percentage of the sale. And so as you're learning DAX, make sure you really concentrate on the context, because it's all about the context and overriding the context. I'm not going to go through that. One thing I do want to talk about is incorporating time intelligence. So when you talk about, most times when you're doing some kind of analysis in a business, you're dealing with some kind of time relational thing. And so in order to deal with time, we have to have a date table, and we have to mark it as a date table, okay? And your date table, I don't know if I can go over this. Yeah, here. So one of the things with your date table is it has to have one row for every date in your range of dates. So let's say you're worried about, you're going to look at the sales between 2010 and 2015. You would have to have in a date table, you would have to end up having a date for every day in that range. All right? Make sense? And it's going to end up, you can actually create this in Excel, or you can import it from a source. A lot of times, maybe your source doesn't have a date table. You can just create it in Excel and bring it in. You could write a SQL query to create it, or I could write an M query to create it, so, which I have done, I have to admit. I do like to geek out on this stuff, but I would never give it to somebody else. Okay, so, and then what you have to do is mark the date table in the model. So that's important. You actually have to have one table, and you can have, remember when I said you're going to have a bunch of different date tables for role-playing conventions? One of them has to be marked as the official date table. Okay, doesn't matter which one, as long as you have a date for every thing. You can actually create a third date table and not even have it in your, attached to your model at all. All this thing is for is this is going to be for DAX functions to work, because they have to have a reference so they can do the kind of stuff. And so in your DAX functions, it's going to ask you which date column is the key. And so in the other thing to remember here is we only need one column in this table. So a lot of times I'll just create my date table with one column in it, the date key, never attach it to my model, and just use it for DAX functionality. Okay. So, I mean, if you already have a date table that has all the dates in it, has that key, then go ahead and use it, even if it's in the model. But if you don't, you can always create your own and just use one column. So the nice thing is in here there's a set of 35 functions that you can go through. The downside is that we have both calendar and fiscal years, but you all know that you're only limited to a traditional fiscal calendar. If you did some places, I still don't know why this is part of business I don't even understand. They'll have like a 3, 5, 4. So quarter one will be like 3 months, quarter two will be like 5 months. Why are you doing it? No, I don't know. So if that happens, you actually have to roll your own, and it's not trivial. So, but it's fun. So if you want to try it, go out and look for some of the blogs on it.
13 months in a year is another good one.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen that too. I was like, what? So what happens is you can do like two date functions, shift date context, evaluate expressions over a period of time. So one of my favorites is total year to date. You can just throw that in there. Another one they actually have in there is closing balance, that they can actually go in and figure out. If you look at the date key, you can do like the last date in the last day of the period in your DAX function. So you can look up what your inventory is that last day of the period or something like that. So it's actually some really neat stuff. And this actually comes up a lot. If you haven't done it, you want to look into semi-additive measures, which means you're going to aggregate over one dimension and then sum it over the other. So example of that is inventory. So you have a semi-additive measures over inventory of your inventory as you go through, and balances, like bank balances and so forth. Quite common to get those in your model. And then some things you can do with Power View that will make your users happy is, again, we talked about hiding columns and renaming columns. That's for any customer, but you can actually add field descriptions in there. So if you go in your column, you can actually add a description, and then when they hover over that in Power View, they'll actually be able to see that description as a pop-up, which actually helps a lot for people. The data category is key. So you want to set the data category here, and you also want to set the default summarization. There's one annoying thing I'll show you here in a minute that always comes up. And you can provide default field sets. So if you provide the default field set, what happens is if they double click on a table, it'll actually add that field set to the screen. And so, like for example, you might have a bunch of fields, but they only usually work with like 4. So I would end up applying those as the default field set. And so once they do it, they can double click. They can always add more, but they double click and it makes it neat. And then set row identifier so you keep unique rows. And then you're going to have a default label and a default image if you want to throw those in there. So when you create a default label and a default image, when you create what they're called cards, it actually makes it look a little bit better. Okay, it'll actually put in the label, be in bold, and so forth. The set row identifier is really something you want to take a look at. So a good example of this, I have a bunch of salesmen, and I would go ahead and I would set up this visual just so salesmen aggregated. So sales name down the one side and what they sold down the other side. You know. Now what happens if I have two guys that have the same name?
Aggregate them together.
It would aggregate them together unless I put a row identifier and signal the row identifier. So if you don't say there's a row identifier which will keep these rows unique, it'll just look at the names and cross them down. But if you say the row identifier keep unique rows and the row identifier is the employee key, then it'll know, it'll say these two names have a different employee key, so I'm not going to put those together. Okay, so that'll come up from time to time. All right, so I got a quick demo here I want to show you. I don't know why, but every time I come out of PowerPivot, it switches it to extend the displays. I don't know. I don't know if it's my machine. I don't know if it's these things. All right. So if I do this one. And I look at, for insert, Power View. And of course they have a tab for Power Query and a tab for Power Pivot, but they hide the Power View and the Power Map. So it's quite annoying. Okay, so you come in here and you look at, has anybody not been in Power Query or Power View? Power View is pretty nice. You come in here and you can go ahead and look at here's the model that's in there. Now one of the things I said was, if you look at it, here's a customer ID field. You definitely want to hide that back in your model so it doesn't show up and so forth. Now, one of the things you're going to look at here is that you have little icons in front. So this country, it knows that is a location type object. So it will, some of them will pick up automatically. Some of them you want to actually set. And so it didn't pick up the city, but back in my model, I can say that this is a location object, city, and we get that little globe there too. But I wanted to show you my #1 pet peeve. Drives me nuts. Okay, so if I take a look at this, I'm going to say, okay, let's pull down the calendar year here. And so what did it do? it summed it up, right? So by default, any number is going to say, okay, we're going to sum this up. Stupid. Okay, so what you have to do is come back into, let me get rid of this because I don't want to blow anything up. You come back into your PowerPivot model. And I go to date. And what was that? That was calendar year, I think. I could do it with anything, but. So I click on calendar year, and so back here in advanced is where you would say summarize by. So you say do not summarize, and so you have to go in there, and once you say that, then it knows when you pulled in. It's not going to do that crap for you. So you want to do that for each of these. It's a number that you don't want to summarize. Okay. And you can also do stuff like summarize, instead of doing an automatic sum, you'll know that they always want to take the average or something like that, so you can set that to an average, a count, whatever. So these kind of things will make the model perform better and work better in Power View. The other thing I wanted to show you is where do you set the default field sets. So back here in this advanced design, you can set the default field sets in here, whatever you want. And the other place is this table behavior. And you'll notice here, this is probably not a good one to show you. Here's the employee. I'll show you that one. So the table default behavior, row identifier. If I pick a row identifier, which would be the employee key, then I can say keep unique rows on the full name. So if we would ever have two guys with the same full name, it would keep them unique. You can say default label. So in this particular case, I would probably put full name again. And then the default image you can have would be like the employee photo. Say OK. And now what happens is when I go into my model and I double click on it, it'll actually pull in the correct stuff for it. Or not the model, the Power View, excuse me. The other thing is here, I said about the data categories. So if I look at sales territory, here's a sales territory region. So you can say data category, and you can say which it is, country, region, and so forth. All right. So that way when you pull it in, you start doing mapping on it, which you can do in Power View. It'll know that you locate those fields. All right. So that's my little spiel. I hope you guys learned some things you can take back with you and start building some really good, solid models. And don't believe Microsoft; it's all about the model. So even though they're trying to hide the model from us, you've got to be able to get into the model and create good models. All right. Thanks. There's actually they just introduced 4 that have a funnel now and so forth. So again, this is all being worked on actively and stuff is being thrown out there all the time. Power Maps. Power Map does. How many of you use Power Map? Now that to me is a toy, but again, it's getting better and better. And one of the things I thought was cool, and I still have to try this, is that you can now do a power map of your own map. So you can actually map the inside of a warehouse in Power Map. Do some cool. That's where it's going to start getting cool. It's being able to do your own map layers and do some of that. So, but I always laugh when they do the video. Look, you can create a video with your Power Map. Yeah, so. Question and answer. Has anybody used that? Yeah, that's one that's actually only on the Office 365 BI portal type thing. But it actually is kind of cool. What happens is you end up taking your model, and your model you're going to create, like for example, one table you might create some, it might be called, employee, it might be called worker, you can do all that stuff, and then they can type in who is the oldest employee, or who is the longest current employee, or something like that. So it actually translates from normal sentences into a query. Now, under the scenes, you have to actually provide the terms that you're going to use and tell them how to map it. But the user then doesn't have to worry about any of that. You can just use natural language. So it's actually kind of cool. And then SharePoint, obviously, for the delivery and collaboration of it. So you have the BI portals where you can post these things and share them and lock them down and all that kind of stuff. And so why is this so performant? And this is one of the reasons you kind of got to know what the engine does to be able to develop your models. So this X velocity engine, what it does, that's the whole engine that makes this thing performant. So it's not just Exchange or Excel, Excel the way it was, they actually added this to it. And so it allows for memory compression, columnar storage, ETL, notice some light ETL stuff, and then you get the really hardcore data guys who can do predictive analysis and all that, analysis of big data and so forth. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. So you look at the user and you can determine how much help they're going to need. So here's the BI self-service stack at this point in time. I'm sure it'll throw something else up here sooner or later. So most people, it started out with PowerPivot, PowerView kind of thing. And then one of the things with PowerPivot is you can bring data in, but if you need to do any ETL work up front before it gets in there, it really isn't set up for that. Okay, so that was a huge hole in this whole thing. And so to plug that hole, they came up with Power Query. How many people have used Power Query? Okay, if you haven't opened it up, I'm going to crack it open. It's not a thing on Power Query, but you definitely want to start looking at Power Query and playing with Power Query. So this is going to allow you to do the ETL process into your model, and then from there you're going to do your Power View, which is your data visualization. Power View. What do you guys think of Power View? Good? Bad?
End users like it.
End users like it?
A bit of a toy.
Yeah. They're still developing it. I think it's a great concept. The problem I have with it is, and the problem I have selling it, as opposed to some other big solutions out there, is the ability to customize it and that kind of thing. You can't pick the colors you want in there. And believe it or not, that's more important to them than the data. They want to know that these branded colors that they paid $1 million for, just somebody come up with, can be in there. Funny story, I was working for an insurance company, and they had their colors and all that. I'm looking at these colors, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get this thing branded in their way, and then I look over at my Dunkin' Donuts cup, and it's the same colors. So they paid some guy, from a marketing firm, a couple $100,000, and he was probably looking at the Dunkin' Donuts cup saying, hey, I like those colors. So anyhow, so the Power View, it's great. They're adding new, they're adding a lot more visualizations to it too. if you do the Office 365 Power View, which is the web, you know, the cloud version, okay, we can probably get started. What I'm going to do today is show you some things about the PowerPivot data models. My name is Dan Clark. I'm from, obviously from the States, and I'm from somewhere around Philly, so that's about the closest landmark that you probably know. If I told you where I'm from, you guys wouldn't know what it is. And so we go to Philly to have fun. So, all right. So I want to get an idea. How many of you are new to the whole Power BI stack? Brand new? How many of you have cracked it open, looked at it, built a couple models? Okay, good. So one of the things I want to do here is we'll go through it and you know, just go ahead and ask questions as we go through. One of the things I want you to get out of this is kind of what you can do to your data model to make it more performant. What you can do to make it more user-friendly when you do your client tools and so forth. So I'll give you a couple tips and that kind of thing. And then, so I'm not going to go over a lot in DAX or anything like that, but if we have time, we can, of course. So one of the things that if you're brand new to the Power BI stack, or you're looking at the Power BI stack and you're saying, why is this gaining so much growth, and can I ignore it, and all that kind of thing? Well, the answer is no, you can't ignore it. And one of the things that you're going to have is a lot of demand for this. And the reason why there's a lot of demand for it is a couple of things. When you talk about traditional BI, you know, the traditional BI was all IT centric, and then the business would have to go through, you know, the whole scenario of requirements gathering and all that stuff. And so if they're going to end up, you know, saying I want this to do some analysis, this particular data set or this particular column added, 2 months later it gets added and they don't even want it anymore. So the time cycles of relying on IT to manage all this is just too long for business these days. Unfortunately, to the people who, you know, the BI guys that are into SQL Server analysis services and don't want to do anything self-service BI. I got a couple of them in my company. I said, well, you better learn it, because say in about a year you're going to have to know it. So it's not going away. And there's some good reasons for that. So it's more agile to change. Remember, business wants to look at what's going on this week. They don't want to, you know, they might wait a day, but that's about it, you know, that kind of thing. And users have more in-depth domain knowledge. So one of the problems with IT is when you are IT-centric on your BI solution, then you have to kind of get a knowledge of what all that data means to the business, okay? And so there's a lot of disconnect between you know, the business analysts and the IT guys. They don't talk the same language. And so you know, every good IT department needs somebody that actually goes between the business and us geek guys and kind of translates back and forth. So if you don't have one of those, it's a real problem. Well, why not just take that out and say, okay, let's put this in the hands of the guys that have the domain knowledge in the first place. The other thing is users are more technical savvy now. So, I mean, you tried this 20 years ago and it wouldn't work because, you know, people, you know, they didn't know computers and all that. Now everybody has a computer, so even your typical person in there can be a little bit more technical savvy. They understand if you tell them and show them some things on how to do it. They're not afraid of the computers and that kind of thing. So, I mean, you still got people that you know, maybe near the end of the retirement or whatever, and they say, I don't want to touch a computer and all that stuff. But then you go to the secretary or something like that, and you work with them, and they work with them. The other thing is that disparate data sources. This is huge. Okay, so if you're talking about you know, what kind of data sources we're using now, well, we're using data sources off of the internet. So we have services that sell data. We have government giving away data. All that we can use and combine in with also our business data, business-centric data, and then get some really interesting analysis going on. So this data comes from disparate sources. You got to merge them into a model, and so again, SQL Service Analysis Services is a great product, but it just doesn't. You would probably have to bring it in. The process would be to get a whole ETL, SSIS stack, move it into staging tables, then move it into the data warehouse, and so forth. So it's a huge effort. Okay, and so the self-service BI has tools that make it a little bit easier to do that. And this is actually huge. Better tools that are easier to use and performant. So, and this is not just Microsoft's tool stack, they're all over. I mean, everybody has BI self-service and is jumping on the bandwagon. And the only reason you can do it is because the tools have become a lot better and they've become a lot more performant. So, if you look at PowerPivot is very performant because of how they build it underneath. And, you know, you're going to be able to get millions of rows of data and that kind of thing. Not that you should, but you can. So, depends on the model. And this is huge here too. So one of the things I try and say for a lot of IT shops is you gotta change the way that you look at your relationships with the business. So one of the things you do is you encourage it, show them how to do this, and then what they do is they go out and do prototyping. And then if you say, okay, this is actually pretty good, we want to share this with the whole business, we want to put it up on a dashboard, something like that, then you can easily import that into a SQL Server analysis services and take it over that way. So it's not an all or nothing type of thing. So you're going to have things that might start out in somebody's own personal analysis, then he shows it to other people in his department, they start using it, and then, you know, the CIO gets a sniff of it and says he wants it, and, you know, then you're going to put it into the repository. So you're still going to have a central corporate-wide type of BI, and you're also going to have these departmental. But this thing is great for prototyping, that kind of thing. And so just a couple of things here on BI users. So not all BI users are created the same. All right, so nearly all users are going to be some kind of report consumer, guided ad hoc analysis. So, you know, you don't try and push everybody into the full-blown BI stack self-service. So some of them you're going to end up, you know, saying, okay, here's some Power Views. I created the model for you, and here's the Power View to go through and work with it. So again, as an IT guy, I'm not going to just say, oh, you go create the model without me helping you out. Or if you can't create the model, some people, I mean, they're just not going to be able to do it. I'll do it for them, then give them this, and then they can create the Power View and do whatever they want for it. Okay, so some people are just going to consume the Power View. Some people are going to create Power Views, and then you're going to have a subset of those which can actually go and create the data models, do some